China has been excluded from international positions and its ability to act as a leading economic and political power. And we think this motion is necessary to correct that and thus ensure that the Chinese people continue to have decent standards of living and regain their rightful place as one of the major nations in the globe. I'm going to be doing two things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to be setting out what we think the comparative is, why we think that without political expansionism, China will be more and more under threat of being constrained by outside factors. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about why this benefits the economy of China to be able to protect itself from shocks and attack and influence the rules of global trade. Let's get straight into this. What do we think the comparative in this debate is? The kind of measures that we support are programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, which seek to link up trade networks into China around the world. We also support things like Chinese participation in joint investment banks, which they lead, which can develop the regions around them, can build infrastructure which make it easier for those countries to trade with China. We also support things to boost Chinese soft power, so sponsoring, for instance, university students to attend China, and ultimately supporting political groups that will do things like oppose anti-Chinese tariff measures. Three ultimate goals from this. One, to prevent the Chinese economy from coming under attack through things like import bans and tariffs. Two, to ensure greater Chinese influence over international and more broadly global institutions. And three, to correct and rebut for anti-Chinese propaganda. For instance, anti-Chinese propaganda in places like Australia and New Zealand, which seeks to deny China the ability to expand. No. Why do we think we need to do this in order to protect the interests of the Chinese people? Recognise that China is a rising power that has for centuries been constrained. First by imperialist practices, which prevented its economy from being able to grow in an independent fashion, and secondarily by a post-Second World War system, which often sought to constrain China and hinder it from gaining power. Crucially, China is currently on the rise and looking to get both economic prosperity and the diplomatic respect and heft a country of its size and population deserved. The problem is that under the status quo, that progress is being hindered. Why? Three reasons. One, there is a backlash against China becoming more economically prosperous and politically powerful. Note that this is not just related to Trump, although Trump is the latest manifestation of that. I want to note that it was the Obama administration which began the Pivot to Asia program, which sought directly to constrain China's rise as a global and political power. But it does continue in the fact that now many countries around the world seek to actively hinder China's ability to grow its economy. Secondly, it has a historic legacy of being excluded from the existing international order. For instance, it only recently joined the WTO, and it has very little say in groups like the IMF. Finally, there's often continued hostility towards China simply because it is China. Note that much claims that Western countries, for instance, need to impose tariffs on China play directly into racial stereotypes. And there's also a lot of Chinese hostility around the world. I'll continue, but first opening.
Do you also support China's role in actively undermining Tibet's ability to self-determine?
We think probably that if Tibet is able to gain independence, the instability that will cause in China will on net be catastrophic for the interests of the Chinese people. We think it will likely lead to violence within that country and will cause a huge amount of instability. Why do we think the alternative, therefore, to political expansionism is going to be so catastrophic? We think, one, there will be an inability to check moves towards hindering Chinese exports. The Chinese economy will find it harder to gain basic goods. It will be harder to continue on a trend of economic growth. But crucially, China will be prevented into transitioning into the high-tech economy that, for all of its people, will give it a good standard of living. For instance, moves against Huawei, which will prevent China from doing things like dominate the 5G industry. Why, therefore, do we think this policy is likely to strengthen the economy of China? Three things on this. One, resources. I want to note that China is currently a very resource-poor country, and consequently it needs a steady supply, both of minerals in order to continue its economic production, so things like cobalt or timber, but also things like food, which will enable its population overall to continue to have a good standard of life and to continue to be able to supply their basic necessities. No. The problem is that under the status quo, China finds it very difficult to get the goods it needs. Why? Three reasons. One, there is often active diplomatic pressure to put pressure on countries to not export key and critical goods to China, and secondly, there often isn't the key infrastructure needed to do that. The impact of political expansionism is that we pressurize states into making those kinds of trades. No, this isn't necessarily the kind of trade which causes backlash against China. It's often things like offering highly generous infrastructure loans in exchange for guarantees of resources in order to build up that diplomatic will that will guarantee China and therefore the Chinese people the ability to access the resources it needs to continue to grow its economy. The impact of not politically expanding in order to ensure the Chinese economy a continued supply of imports is that the ability of the Chinese economy to grow becomes hindered. The ability of it to take people out of unemployment and out of rural poverty becomes hindered. Many Chinese people will continue to live a life which is poor, and they will not be able to raise their living standards. And ultimately, a failure to see continued rises in living standards will cause instability for the Chinese economy, for the Chinese society as a whole, as people become disillusioned with the government. They might say that that's a good thing. We would counter that kind of instability may well lead to conflict on a huge scale, may well lead to increased repression and hinders the reforms that the CCP is currently implementing. Second reason why this is beneficial is it's needed for economic development, to do things like block the ability of China to export its goods from countries which are currently going to demand that China stops running a trade surplus with them. The reason that this is necessary is that only when you have projects like Belt and Road and significant political influence over countries does it become virtually impossible for them to significantly detach themselves from the Chinese economy. Under the status quo, it is easy for countries to place trade restrictions on China if they don't have particularly strong connections to that economy. The more integrated their economies become with the Chinese, the less likely they are to do things like impose tariffs on China that again will constrain its economic growth, lead to unemployment and therefore instability. Finally, this gives China the ability to influence international frameworks. It gives them the ability to, for instance, have a greater say on dictating how climate change reduction will be implemented in a way which helps the Chinese people, rather than simply be the conception of Western outsiders who impose it upon them. This is needed in order to continue the growth in the Chinese economy, the growth and prosperity for its people, and to rectify the harms that China has suffered. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. Start the off case. I'd like to invite the leader of this. During the speech. Sorry, before you start, could you close the door in case someone comes in? Thanks.
All good to go. Great. 2 points in this speech. One, why we don't think it's going to succeed as a strategy and is going to result in far more instability and threats towards China that results in all the consequences opening government wants to talk about. Secondly, we're going to talk about even how should it succeed. We think it's far better for China to pursue the alternative strategies. What do we think China would likely do if it wasn't going to follow political expansionism? One, we think it's probably to deal with a great more internal investment, at the point at which you can't just direct people towards the things you're doing externally. We think it results in a lot more internal investment in strengthening and dealing with the inherent weaknesses in the Chinese economy. But secondly, we would note that this doesn't mean you no longer trade. We would say it's the way you set up partnerships with countries and you try and set up amicable relationships with those countries. What Proposition specifically has to defend is the active attempts to undermine those countries and intervene in their democracies, where you back parties, where you manipulate them in order to get ahead for your goals. We would say many of the benefits they've talked about are just inherent to good trading relationships that we can set up anyway under our status quo. They have to deal with that interventionism in order for them to get ahead. So before those points, look, let's deal with the points that they set up. One, he paints this context of China being oppressed from the start. That's not true. Since World War II, there's actually been a great deal of facilitation of their growth. The US was perfectly happy and in fact did do a lot to allow their economy to flourish, and has been very good at creating the institutions and including them in the institutions that gave them political power and allowed them to rise in the way that they did. Next, he seems to paint this idea that it's all racism that countries are going after. This is not true. It's because China has not been innocent. We would ask, and we're going to talk about this in our point more extensively, in which world do you think countries are more likely to lobby for sanctions against China, more likely to enter into trade disputes, more likely to see them as a hostile threat that needs to be clamped down? We would say all of these are the worlds in which they support, where China is actively trying to undermine their interests in order to push their agenda. We would say the reason that there's been a backlash against China recently is precisely because they followed the policy that side-opening government has proposed. That's what's led to the raising tariffs against them. We think China was doing perfectly well, and its massive surge in growth occurred primarily before they implemented that expansionary policy. We think the quiet policy is far more effective. The rest for rebuttal will be integrated. Okay, let's move on to the first point as to why we think this is a bad long-run strategy for China to gain influence within the international domain. Look, the first part is that we think mechanistically this strategy pisses off a lot of countries. Why? One, we think that directly it undermines the US. At the point at which China is seeking to actively undermine and remove your autonomy by intervening, we would say that poses them as a hostile threat. It's also worth noting that when they're actively trying to tamper with democracies, that's when the US gets really angry, because they are actually trying to undermine the world's order institutions that the US has set up. The point at which they're trying to exploit the WTO's institutions and get around them, we would say that's the point at which the US gets angry with them and reasons to see them as an escalation. It's also worth noting that there's inherently difference to the US between a strong China and a China that is seeking to push its influence over the rest of the globe. The one is a potential ally that doesn't have conflicting interests, and in fact, because they're such a large trading partner, you have a great deal of influence in helping. We would say the other is exactly what has driven the US and China to currently enter into a trade war. It's precisely because China is seeking to be an active threat against the US and push against their agenda that we think you have the risk of rising sentiment. It's also worth noting that this has been the first issue to unite both the Democrats, Republicans, and Donald Trump's, the threat against China. Even if a massive trade war or flat-out war is a low probability, the consequences should it break out are massive and very devastating, particularly to the poorest. But let's say that scenario doesn't occur. There's some stability within trade with the US and with other countries. We would say that this inherently pushes away all their allies. Look at how India has reacted to the Belt and Road Initiative, where they've seen China actively trying to encircle them in what they call the Ring of Pearls and setting up military bases around them. When they see them actively messing with the politics in Kashmir and Pakistan, they see them as an active threat. When they see them as potentially trying to manipulate their own elections, that's when you get the outcries and the rallying that looks to want to be more hostile towards China, to be wary to giving them an economic benefit that lets them get ahead. What's the comparative? We think there's many good arguments to trade with China. They're particularly good at a number of industries that the surrounding territories aren't good in. They have centralized around the fact that they are the country that has the greatest manufacturing sector and is expanding into new tech sectors. The reasons for these countries to trade with China are vast, unless they see them as a threat. At that point, they have an incentive not to let China get ahead and not to grow. We would say a far better policy is where your trade partners feel they can trust you and I'll take partner in along. This is where they're far more likely to build amicable relationships, and we would say that's far more sustainable. The alternative is China continuously having to intervene, continuously being resentful, because those relationships aren't built on mutual trust, but active aggression. Short closing.
The only reason India is upset is because China has more influence in countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Given that the comparative then is some influence versus no influence, why is your side better?
Look, I've dealt with this. The fact that India is actually hostile because they see them actively tampering with which to undermine it and being expansionist against it. There's vastly difference between that and just negotiating and trading. Okay, why do we think this is bad, even should it succeed? One, it's worth noting that the opportunity cost is vast. At the moment, they are investing billions in projects outside their borders. We would say this money would be better directed internally. It's also worth noting that many of the investments aren't that productive because they're towards gaining that influence. It's not particularly beneficial to buy out a port that isn't doing any good within that region. It's far more beneficial. They do it simply in order to get that political influence. Spending to influence parties isn't the best investment. We would say alternatively investing internally is far more productive. But more than this, we would say it's problematic in terms of domestic politics. Why? Because we think this is exactly what Xi Jinping and the Communist Party wants, because it allows them to direct attention away from their internal policies. We would say that the reason they are so pro this expansionist policy is because it's a good way to build up. If there's a trade war with the US, they can redirect attention to being external and the need to defend China as opposed to internal politics. What's the alternative? We would say that at the moment there's growing consumer demand within China and growing calls for accountability. If the Communist Party can't justify what they are doing by external means, they have to justify their power by meaningfully uplifting the people internally within China. They have to deliver on those economic promises that we think creates far more accountability. Why do we think this is good? We think in general, for the people of China, that immediate internal investment without that dictating or direction towards enemies outside is far more influential, and that gaining authority and ability to hold account for the government is far more meaningful upliftment. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I'd like to invite the DPF. Here.
Look, if China had infinite resources and could just continually invest into its internal processes such that everybody could have a fantastic standard of living, that might be a better idea than this policy. That is very clearly not the reality they face, where they have enormous amounts of growth that have existed for a long period of time, but that need to be maintained, particularly through a transition into a higher skill economy. Kit gives you clear reasons why that is better facilitated by actively meddling in the affairs of other countries, particularly by economic means. I think we got very little response to that. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, a brief comparative of what the biggest interests of the Chinese people are. Secondly, an explanation of why this policy specifically is successful. Then thirdly, why it's necessary and is the best way to get the things that the Chinese people most need. All rebuttal is going to be integrated within that. So firstly, in terms of interest, there's kind of an upside-downside question here, because we think the potential upside for China is extremely high. Kit mentions to you they can become a growing, thriving economy, in particular in terms of things like controlling production of mobile phones, for example, where they're already very good. They're taking good steps forward into that. The potential for that in the future is a continuation and kind of finalization the poverty reduction project that they've managed to undertake, where 800 million people have been brought out of poverty already, where there are still a few hundred million to go. But ultimately, the standard of living within China can keep on rising and be excellent for the people within it. The comparative that Kit gets you, though, and gives no engagement, is that if that growth starts to slow, then you risk, A, significant backtracks in those projects, where you can no longer continue to do things, like do projects that specifically just get rural people out of poverty, even though there's minimal economic benefit to doing so. That obviously is bad, A, just because tons of people die and live horrible lives, but secondly because you risk greater instability and crack down on any kind of democratic process that might happen, potential for violence and fighting. That, I think, is the context within which this debate takes place. And that's why the stuff we've already told you is so crucial in terms of explaining why the economic gains and the security, in particular, that this gains you is so beneficial. Before I move on, briefly to deal with what we told about how this kind of directs attention away from the Chinese government, because they can just point at international institutions. I think, firstly, this is clearly false, and that the thing that matters most to people on the ground, particularly if you're very poor, it's like your day-to-day circumstances and how much money you're likely to have into the future. Thus, I think this question probably hinges on the rest of the debate. Secondly, even if that were true, it's kind of unclear why it matters where specific attention lies, given that most of this policy is controlled beyond the interests of the people. So, secondly, why is this policy so successful? Now, first to deal with what we had from opening opposition, because their claim is that in the absence of this, China can just have nice trade partnerships with everybody else and would be accepted full stop. This is abjectly false. Why? Number one, because China's status will inevitably make it seen as a threat by groups like the US. You cannot be a global power without A, risking just like fear from somebody else who wants to be bigger than you, but B, and more importantly, intruding on their spheres of influence, right? China and US are fighting across the globe right now. It's impossible for China to have the kind of trade partnerships it wants without those inevitably stepping on the US's toes. So I think it is ridiculous to say they will not care in those instances. But secondly, they carry a clearly opposing ideology that is a direct marked difference to what the US has purported. Their attempts to spread democracy are directly in opposition to what the Chinese government is. Therefore, there will always, as you point out, be many factions within the US that always wants to curtail their influence. Similarly, China also has regional, territorial concerns that will continue even if it, dropped this policy, right? So I don't think you could just fear in that China should also ditch all of its other interests that have been standard for a number of years in terms of, for example, a one China policy or gaining control of the South China Sea, be that purely because of Chinese ideology or be it to control the oil resources that exist there. The upshot of all of that is to say that China will always face pushback and kickback, far more so than any other country, just because of its size and its nature. Given that, this is the best way to secure that, because if you don't take active steps to try and control that, bad things will happen. What are they? Number one, you are more likely to get active kickback within those countries. So compare a China which actively puts pressure on political parties to be supported, which gets those parties elected, right? Then has stable support within those countries and can help to put policies in place that will continue to support those. Secondly, there will be active US undermining of those policies in the future unless you take a firm hand to try and secure your interests there. So the difference between this, say, just having a trade policy and having quite restrictive deals, for example, that guarantee Chinese interests, that in some cases put Chinese troops on the ground to protect those interests, is long-term security, which means you can then build. You can do the kind of 10 or 15-year-long projects that have been the very reason that China has been so good at poverty reduction in the past. All of that is essential to getting the kind of interest that we're talking about. I'll take closing in a second if they have one.
Yeah.
I'll take it now.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you say that the China's toe-stepping, rather the changes in that don't matter very much. I think the toe-stepping scales, because narratives of China controlling international institutions, controlling other countries, feed into narratives that are powerful in developed states, where they are fragile and they believe that they are being taken over.
Two things on this. Number one, people will always push those narratives because creating an international enemy, particularly in the West, tends to be politically popular. So even if China does pull back, I think in particular Republicans will always make hay out of saying China is a big power and risk. It is not the actual policies they undertake, but rather their presence as a global power which makes the difference. But secondly, particularly in developing countries, I think this policy is self-correcting insofar as if you do get pushback from internal populations, if you do have countries that push back on you, then it's in China's interest, and we have seen them do reductions in those and striking a balance between securitizing their own interests but also recognizing that if you step too far, those countries will probably push back against you. We think that that balance lies in taking a reasonably firm hand and recognizing where you might take a step too far, rather than just saying there's no way we can do any of that, let's step back. That's what we stand for. Finally, why is this so necessary for the Chinese people? So I think there are a few essential things here. Kit gives you tons of analysis about this protects you from things like future tariffs, which we say will happen anyway, and so on and so forth. But there's a few extra things I want to add. Number one, these are pushes that no one else is doing. So in particular, in controlling things like resources, controlling, for example, the coltan supply in the center of Africa, that makes an enormous difference going forward to these people. The second thing to note, though, is in terms of diplomacy, international institutions and shaping rules, particularly when it comes to things like future technology that Kit mentioned, you're able to do far, far better things in being able to shape the way those policies are constructed, particularly towards Chinese interests. Finally, though, I think you are better able to gain allies and do things like secure military bases in places like Vietnam, for example, where they are able to better facilitate putting Chinese troops on the ground, being able to control territory in a way that I think Chinese people probably do care about, even just beyond the economic interest that we've already talked about, in terms of gaining security and being recognized as a global power. Ladies and gentlemen, very proud to propose.
GPM to review the off case can invite the dialogue. Here we are.
reality in this debate is actually that Republicans were willing to encourage China being admitted into the IMF and World Trade Organization. It's not clear that Republicans are always going to hate China and try to push sanctions on them, as the opening government would assert, because empirically that's just not what's happened. The international global system was perfectly happy, especially when China was focusing more internally than they were on the system of sharp power of trying to undermine the interests and impose their interests in these countries where they were operating. In those cases, the international system was willing to allow China to have a greater role, to be involved in trade. And we think that the comparative, where they go back to that, where they go back to focusing on consolidating their economic growth by strengthening their internal capacity, is a better way to make sure that they are not seen as a threat, but rather seen as a useful trading ally to the international system. And that's how you don't get the kinds of backlash that the opening government is so concerned about. The context that they raise is just not the reality, right? The US invited China to help maintain a lot of the international institutions like the World Trade Organization and the IMF. They were very eager for China to get more involved in these organizations because they thought it would be a good thing for Chinese people. Additionally, we think that on average, if China and the US were to go into some kind of straight up conflict with one another, where if China is directly and actively undermining the interests of the US, that's far more likely. We think it's very likely that the US would win because they're a far larger and wealthier economy that has larger capacity to sustain and survive those kinds of conflicts, which is again bad for Chinese people for the destability, unstabilizing reasons that they talk about. What do we tell you is the comparative, and why is it the most likely thing to happen in this round? Because the Chinese government has a significant interest in maintaining legitimacy by providing materially better off living conditions for the people in their country. If they aren't able to push a narrative of Chinese empire and expansionism and distract people from the fact that the material conditions aren't improving, and they assert this won't happen. This is exactly what Russia does all the time. They point to the need to be externally influential as a reason why material living conditions aren't rising within the country. Because the Chinese government's stability and position relies so strongly on whether or not they have economic legitimacy, it's incredibly likely that they'll invest in growing the consumer capacity of the Chinese people. And we think that's how we benefit the Chinese people greater on our side, when they're not distracting themselves with unproductive investments and international interventionism that alienates them from the international system. No, thank you. Why is this the case? OG tells us that China needs resources. That's true, but the people that they need resources from are always going to trade with them because it's poor commodity countries like in Africa who don't have many trade alternatives and are desperately in need of foreign capital. We don't think those are the countries that are massively influenced and need to be pushed by China on their side. What are the countries that are that China needs to push and bully, right? It's the Asian countries that they want to push trade into. So what's the comparative on our side? Because they need someone to consume their products and sell and buy their products, it's most likely that China invests in growing consumer demand. And there's where you get our major benefit for Chinese people. If you invest in growing consumer demand to sustain your economy, you have a situation where you're making sure that your people have more money and more capacity to buy things that they can choose for themselves to make their lives better off. We think the impact of this is that more Chinese people have more freedom to live the lives that are meaningful for them, and more likely that people, specifically in rural areas who have less economic capacity at the moment, are lifted out of poverty when the focus is on them rather than the focus on growing the tech giants into these international companies. And so we think on that comparative, we massively improve Chinese people's lives better on our side than on their side, where they improve the interests of Chinese companies. That's distinct, especially if you look at rising inequality. Growing the material capacity of the Chinese companies, especially the giants, isn't something that is going to benefit the Chinese people, and specifically isn't about investing in growing consumer demand for the people who are most likely to need it. So rural people, poorer people, the people who don't consume that much at the moment. So we think on our side, we get a major benefit for Chinese people, especially the most vulnerable people. And we told you this is the most likely thing to happen because firstly, this is what was happening in the past. This is the way that China was operating before they started being more expansionary. But secondly, because their government compact relies on this economic legitimacy, they will turn back to that system of economic legitimacy. For all those reasons, we've already shown you how this helps the Chinese people the most, and therefore we should win this debate. Secondly, though, let's talk about why this is going to actively undermine, why using this policy is actively going to undermine the ability for China to be influential because of the kinds of backlash that they assert are already happening, getting far worse. But first, I'll take a point from closing.
China's excess steel production is greater than the amount of steel America, the UK, and Australia produce in 1 year. In the absence of more foreign investment, where do you offload that excess production?
You can still have foreign investment. In fact, you're more likely to have foreign investment in a situation where people aren't actively hostile to the fact that you're intervening in their places. This is about China investing elsewhere. That's a different debate. Okay, so why do we think that on their side, the United States is going to be specifically hostile? Because the United States is specifically committed to democracy and countries being able to self-determine, and they're pushing a system of expansionism in which China tries to undermine the ability for countries to determine for themselves. That's where you get the conflict. They assert that any big country is going to be a threat. That's just not true. Look at Europe. Look at Japan. Especially Japan, which was a threat to the US at the end of World War II, but then moderated by being a beneficial trade partner that was able to provide things that was useful to the United States. That's when we saw the moderation and accepting of them. China is able to do the exact same thing by providing the products that US consumers and European consumers like to buy. At the moment, by being the kind of force that is trying to undermine and thwart and frustrate the US, undermine their allies, undermine democracy, they're following a Russian path. That's when they're going to continue to limit and undermine, when the US is going to continue to limit and undermine China. That's the Gov model. But our model, one about trade, consolidating your economic capacity, is one in which they're not seen as a threat, because being a big country, when you provide benefits to the international system, is not scary. It's scary when you as a country are going to try to undermine the ability for other countries to live the way they want to live. The second kind of hostility that you get on their side is countries like Malaysia and India becoming more and more suspicious of accepting these kinds of deals, which means the strategy might be successful in the short term, but in the medium term, when you see ports being repossessed, when you see elections being interfered with, they stop trusting this kind of investment. And that means that you don't get the ability to gain these kind of investment deals in the long term. The international system is a long-run repeated game. It might win in the short term, but we're already seeing the backlash against it. It's not going to be successful in the long term because countries like the ability to determine for themselves what is valuable, what kind of lives they want to live. And by definition, this is a policy which undermines this. What we think on our side is that you are more likely to have the US allow China to grow and trade. On their side, you have far less of that, and we are the side that is going to create the best accountability for the Chinese people by strengthening their material conditions and allowing them to hold the state in check. Thank you.
Ready? China's model of economic growth since the 1980s depended on massively increasing and accelerating production and manufacturing so that people would be employed and that people would have jobs. Now, the diminishing marginal return on that rate of growth and that model of growth means that China's economy now has structural deficiencies that are unlikely to be solved in the absence of policies that actively allow China to offload the inefficiencies and deficiencies in its economy to other countries so its economy is more insulated internally. The framing I think you should employ from this round is that domestic affairs that impact China's internal economy have a much greater impact on the average Chinese citizen than does whether or not China has 10 more votes on the UN Security Council. Therefore, the framing and what you should care more about is China's internal economic growth and the ability of Chinese citizens to buy into that. Bit of rebuttal to opening opposition. They say countries like the US and India will have backlash. I think I already addressed most of this in OPOI in the sense that backlash only exists insofar as power is being created for China. That is to say that their argument is a concession of the progress that is made on this policy. But secondly, note that you often create norms within a vast majority of different countries. That is to say, you're able to split up traditional American allies, meaning that the ability of the United States to coordinate on the ground is significantly limited. For instance, when Duterte withdrew the Philippines lawsuit from the International Criminal Court, or whatever it was, against China, it undermines the ability of countries like Indonesia and Malaysia to use that legal precedent to fight off China's influence with American backing. So the ability to split regional American ally bloc is relatively important. Secondly, note that Chinese investment is often directed by the state, whereas American and Western investment tends to be much more disparate and determined by private actors, meaning that the ability of the United States and countries like India to counteract Chinese influence, specifically economic influence, is much more limited. Thirdly, they say, active interventionism, not just good trade deals, is what you have to do. I think this is where my framing about China's internal economy comes in. Because note that a lot of these deals tend to be unpopular on the ground, especially during shocks, right? That is to say that there's a perception that Chinese people are coming and taking people's jobs, which is what happened in Kenya, for instance. The ability to influence governments to make policies that otherwise might be not democratically supported is the most important thing. Secondly, note that the specific way in which China does this is it forces countries into long-term contracts, which allows it to shield itself from political viability that happens when these projects happen to go wrong and new governments get elected. So the Prime Minister of Malaysia can change, but the contract that the country of Malaysia signed does not, meaning that you're insulated from the domestic political shock of countries. Thirdly, note that the reason you need active intervention, not just good trade deals, is because sometimes you need bad trade deals for countries. So you create redundant projects that don't benefit the home country of China. So you build a massive port in Sri Lanka that allows China to construct a massive amount of concrete and stuff that produces no real benefit for a country that doesn't get that much trade and has other ports, but it benefits China. Fourthly, note that in countries like dictatorships like the Congo, you're just more actively able to do this. So, structural deficiencies in China's economy and how you change this. First, note that China's economy and production is currently facing significant amounts of overcapacity and diminishing marginal growth. A couple reasons for this. First, the obvious 2008 financial crisis meant that exports dropped massively while the government subsidized manufacturing to a large extent, meaning there was a significant amount of overcapacity. Secondly, note that there's a baseline level of employment that the CCP is willing to not let drop, meaning that the supply of goods that it will try to produce is always constant, whereas the demand it will face is rather limited, especially with the resurgence of manufacturing competitors in places like India and Mexico, also the trade war, which means that the CCP needs to be able to produce a significant amount, a baseline amount of manufacturing goods in order to keep the vast majority of people employed, or at the very least, somewhat happy. Note that demand for Chinese goods, especially Chinese manufactured input goods, have been declining recently, which is why the massive amount of overproduction I told you about earlier. What exactly is the impact of Chinese expansion? It allows China to offload the massive amount of excess capacity it's built up in the vast majority of factories and plants and industries to other countries, places like the Philippines or Sri Lanka or the Congo. This is particularly important because it buys into OO's framing that we have to go one step further than provide good trade. So you build bridges in Malaysia that don't really have to be built because what China really cares about is just making sure the concrete gets out of their country and goes into another country. What is the impact in the absence of China's ability to offload this excess production onto other countries? First, note that the fact that you have massive amounts of excess production means that the price of the commodity you're selling is likely to decline. So China's massive excess production of coal is one of the reasons why coal tends to decline in price over the last 5 or 10 years. What is the impact of this? First, note massive amounts of unemployment at the point at which SOEs in China, which direct the vast majority of development, especially in key strategic industries, are likely going to face significant cutoffs because they don't have the capacity to gain the amount of revenue they need to maintain basic levels of employment. I would say that massive amounts of concentrated employment, especially because these are based on individual plants, in places like Linfen, which is primarily based on coal, is significantly important for the average Chinese citizen because of their ability to, get a job and feed themselves. This is probably the most direct impact on the average Chinese person in this round. Secondly, internal migration within China and the way this is offset. Because note that for the very reasons that China's developed, the vast majority of this development has gone to cities for the very simple reason that it's easier to gain economies of scale in cities. What this means is there's a significant incentive on the part of rural immigrants in China, of which there are many, to immigrate to Chinese cities. The fact that we know this is 300 million people have internally migrated within China. The problem with this is that continuous rural migration to cities has diminishing effects and negative effects in the long run. First, note that you're likely to have significantly more wage competition, especially at the lower end of the economic market. But secondly, note that significant amounts of rural slums, urban slums, which is what happens when people are forced into low labor industries or can't get jobs, is more likely to create the sort of collective action and labor unrest that's more likely to cause instability for the vast majority of people in China opening.
Look, dumping isn't a sustainable strategy for industries because you've got to offload the goods really cheaply, which means inevitably China's going to have to switch away from that strategy of offloading concrete anyway.
A couple things. First, you can't, this isn't the case when you have long-term contracts that set in the price of the commodity you're selling for the next 99 years, meaning that even if the prices would have decreased in a market rate, that's not really what you're competing against. Secondly, okay, worst case, that's a short-term solution compared to continuing the problem, okay? So, China, these deals specifically allow China to offset a significant amount of migration to other countries. You know this because there are about 1 million Chinese people living in Africa right now, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, living across Southeast Asia. This is particularly important because note in the absence of just good trade deals, that a large number of foreigners coming in are likely perceived as a threat by a significant amount of the domestic population. That the ability of China to use expansionism to get domestic governments to agree with this, even if it's politically unpopular, is how you offset this migration. Thirdly, note that secondly, they say, internal investment can increase on this side. I think that for all the reasons I've given, internal investment increasing in China is likely to A, have diminishing marginal returns, meaning that the same efficacy doesn't happen on both sides, but B, likely contributes to the same degree of overcapacity of industry and overcapacity in cities that I explained. But secondly, note that proud to pros.
Alright, thank you very much, Member of Gulf. Start the CO case. I'd like to invite the member from here.
In the airport in Johannesburg, I picked up a copy of the Johannesburg local newspaper, and I found an interesting item. It was a full-page ad copied from the People's Daily, extolling the benefits of China and interaction with China. There is a reason that China has to run these sorts of ads in South African papers. It's because China has become hugely controversial in South Africa, something that we think suggests government's policy is not working. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First, that China should have other priorities beyond being a superpower at this particular moment in time. And second, that this is a really bad way to try to become a superpower. So first, on the question of what China's priorities should be. For many years, the CCP has offered the Chinese people a tacit bargain that they would keep economic growth at 10% or near that number in exchange for mass popular support for the CCP program. Now, growth has slowed to close to 6%. We think that opening government is wrong when they identify the primary problem as resource constrainedness. Indeed, China is still able to trade with most of the world, and we would stand behind opening opposition in saying that they can trade with that world more easily when it isn't divided into mutually antagonistic trading blocs. The problem is not resource constrainedness, but the fundamental inefficiencies of the Chinese economy. It is massively and structurally inefficient, because there are huge numbers of SOEs, parastatals, quangos, things with political appointees known as princelings who come from politically connected families and have no business running those entities. Because many of these entities are invested in each other, and there's massive financial inter-risking of these large SOEs who are invested in policy banks or directly invested in each other. Notice that this inefficiency is a premise of the CG case, right? Because the CG case is we need to keep producing more steel than is profitable to produce to keep employing people. The premise here is that the economy is massively inefficient. Now, the good news is that there is recognition of this within the Politburo, within the higher echelons of Chinese leadership. You can see this by looking at the people that Xi Jinping has recently appointed to economic planning committees and his top economic advisors. The problem is, when you adopt a policy of political expansionism, you need SOEs and you need massive CCP control over the economy for this to work. Why? First, because you need to negotiate investments government to government at forums and summits like FOCAC, which you can only do when you have direct control over these SOEs. Second, because you need globally integrated supply chains. And third, because you need to make unprofitable investments. Another premise of the CG case, right? It only works if you have large SOEs that you can politically coerce into making an investment in some developing country that isn't going to make them very much money, but will buy China some degree of political favor. If you have an economy where individual businesses are free to make decisions on the basis of their profit margin, you are not able to pursue this policy the way China has been pursuing it. We think that economic expansionism is standing between the People's Republic of China and needed reforms that would prevent something like an enormous financial crash that Western provinces in particular, like Qinghai, simply could not withstand. Notice that I think we provide a more plausible path to the long-term economic development of China, or the long-term economic stability of China, than closing government. Although I agree with them that that is probably the most important area of this debate. Because their model is not sustainable anyway. Manufacturing is already cheaper in Bangladesh and Vietnam, and it is unlikely that China is going to continue perpetually producing massive amounts of steel. Instead, privatizing SOEs, something that we've talked a lot about at this tournament, and having the ability to reform when you aren't tied into an economic influence model would be massively beneficial. But the second thing I'm going to talk about, this is just a bad way to become a superpower, even if that is what China should be concerned about at the moment. So, sure, I'll take it over.
Okay, except that companies like Alibaba or Huawei are not inefficient. They have huge technological achievements, but are going to be shut out of key markets that will benefit the Chinese people and be hindered from importing things they need to survive.
I just think it is far more likely that Alibaba and Huawei are shut out of these markets when you create the markets being massively antagonistic towards those companies. That is falling behind OVO, but I think it was a pretty good argument that they made. Okay, so we think that China is at a unique moment right now, because OG says no one else is doing this. We think that is nonsense. Look at British and American mining in Papua New Guinea. Look, all the other major powers like the US and Russia are known to meddle, both economically and politically. And simultaneously, thanks to reshifting alliances and patterns of catching up in development, there is an intensely multipolar world, which gives developing countries more bargaining power than they have had throughout history in deciding which countries to make deals with. We think that the reason that many developing states have historically worked with China is precisely because it didn't meddle. That's why Imran Khan in Pakistan has turned to the PRC rather than the IMF, because the IMF would have imposed more political constraints internally. That's why there was so much investment in Africa, because unlike France and the United States, the PRC didn't have massive numbers of military bases in Africa. We think that when you start doing this sort of meddling, you lose the very goodwill that has made deals with China attractive in the first place. This is why many politicians in the developing world right now run on anti-China platforms. People like Michael Sata in Zambia or Nelson Chamisa in Zimbabwe, who run on platforms pointing to horror stories like the Sri Lankan ports that were literally appropriated by the Chinese investment wings, who run on this type of paranoia about China that is popular in the developing world. A few reasons for this. First, there are small and isolated expatriate communities. Second, there are limited cultural ties. You can look at surveys like Afrobarometer or similar surveys, analogous surveys in Latin America, and show that people still generally would prefer that they were linked to countries like the United States than that they were linked to China. Third, in most of the developing world, we have successfully sold the idea of democracy. Democracy is hugely popular, and the idea that China would influence a system and undermine that system makes it deeply problematic to these people. And fourthly, horror stories like racial discrimination on the SGR standard gauge railroad in Kenya or the Sri Lankan ports. All of these things mean that when China abandons its previous policy, because that is what government is standing behind, abandoning the previous policy of making economic deals but not interfering in the domestic politics of these countries, the developing world, which does have options, is actually less willing to engage and deal with China. We think that the old adage about winning more flies with honey than with vinegar stands in this case, because the comparative advantage of China is to not interfere, is to get these deals, is to attract more friends, win more friends, and influence more people, and have more seats at more tables when it is able to sell that it is not like the Americans, that it is not like the Russians. We think that this is a unique ability for China to succeed. So because China should be focused on economic reforms, and because this isn't the way to become a superpower, we're very happy to oppose
The structure of the Chinese economy is one that requires massive production. Ops arguments of trade deals and economic reformation can't exist in a country with massive overpopulation, current resource overproduction, and with no way to get out of its current economic crisis of having a crap ton of resources that they can't get rid of. On our side of the house, what we say is the solution is to be able to retain China's influence long enough to actually restructure the economy, long enough to ensure that it actually can exist long term, instead of the deals that opposition wants to make, which will only result in its economy collapsing. A couple points of rebuttal before moving through each team in this round and saying why they lost to us. Okay, rebuttal. First thing that we get in a POI from opening opposition is that dumping is unsustainable. One, we say that the long-term contracts that China locks in prices means that you recognize the kind of stability we get on our side that noticeably doesn't come from the types of unsustainable trade deals you get on your side. Namely, on our side, China literally has contracts that exist for 100 years, where on your side, trade deals tend to be more short-term because of the political incentives of the people who are there, which you can't change when you won't actually mess with their policy. But second of all, even in the worst case scenario, we say that this is a short-term solution that allows China to mitigate the harms of overcapacity until its economy can actually reform internally, which can't happen on your side of the house when you take the existing economic problems and just exacerbate them. Let's talk about CO. The main claim of CO's case is that China should reform its economy instead of doing this. That is the only way that they're actually going to get any traction. One, we say that reform can't happen as much because of the political power of SOEs within China. State-owned enterprises aren't something that you can simply say are like, fine, and we'll get rid of them. On our side of the house, they exist and you need to deal with them. Same on yours. Second of all, regardless of whether or not China can reform, the overcapacity problem still exists and won't have a solution. Namely, there are too many goods in the status quo, and it is an immediate problem that needs fixing. They can't simply say, let's weigh long-term over short-term, because in the short term, if your economy collapses due to unemployment, we don't think you actually have any long-term benefits. You can't reform an economy when it's collapsing. But third of all, we say that Chinese investment actually allows China to reform its economy easier. Why? We say that dumping overcapacity allows China to make SOEs less inefficient and reduce the amount of debt that they currently hold. That only happens when you actually have a stable place to put the goods that you're currently producing. But second of all, we say that it limits the rural-urban migration, which allows wages to rise, creating the consumer economy that allows for the type of internal investment that opposition actually wants. The problem with opposition is that they claim that they want all these benefits without actually showing you the mechanisms for how they get there without an economic collapse. You can't take a country like China, who is consistently overproducing, and simply say, we're overnight going to change the economic structure, when that is one that will result in the immediate harms that Jinmo gives you. But let's talk about OO and recognize that a lot of OO's arguments were carried down the bench, so this applies to both. Okay, one, they say that internal investment is better. We say that this doesn't align with the current state of China's economy, i.e. overcapacity means it's reliant on its ability to invest outside its borders, not within them. Projects for workers, countries that need infrastructure, like there's only so many bridges you can build within China before you have a problem. But you also need to address how this transition happens without mass unemployment, which we say is pretty bad for the average individual Chinese person. On our side, we think this transition actually happens easier. But two, we say that the impact on their internal investment is a lot more debt in the Chinese economy, which only makes this like economic collapse that much worse at the point where you don't actually have it leveraged over multiple states. But second of all, they say that trade deals are preferable. One, we say that oftentimes trade deals are unpopular. The types of actions that they say people taking in order to create backlash to China still happen on your side of the house when Chinese is trying to flood markets with cheap goods that outcompete domestic producers. We don't think everyone's going to be like, China's good all of a sudden on their side of the house when we still see it has this reputation. The question then becomes whether China can control this backlash through political manipulation, or whether they're forced out of profitable trade relations. See what just happened with the US. But second of all, we say that more competition means you can't actually trade enough to offset the current needs. OO wants to live in a world where China is the only producer, which is simply not true anymore. There are many countries that are producing, so China needs to have some sort of advantage over them in order to actually get the deals it wants. Maybe China's ability to actually meddle politically within other countries is the advantage it needs to actually be able to produce those goods instead of competing with all of these other countries that are willing to outcompete it. The population of China is also such that it needs massive production in order to keep them employed. So for closing opposition to come up here and simply say, we'll just produce less, where are all those people going to go for jobs? But third of all, we say that trade deals are unstable, meaning economic investments on our side are often long-term because you can manipulate the government of somewhere to agree to a 100-year trade deal, whereas on your side you can't, so you're most likely have short-term trade deals. Then you end up exacerbating the problem we currently see, because these short-term deals means you're constantly exposed to the instability that happens when people give up on your trade deals. But third of all, what OO says is that backlash is bad for China, and again, this goes up and down the bench. We say this happens anyway when there are massive amounts of cheap goods flooding the market. It makes domestic companies compete, and Chinese workers coming and taking your jobs is not something that international economies usually like. So what that means is the question is whether or not you actually have a power to control this, whereas on our side, we absolutely think you do. Sorry, Fronthalf, do you have something?
Look, this kind of leverage hollows out the economy in the long term because no one wants to engage with you once they see that you're going to screw over their country and you end up isolated with a weak economy like Russia.
The fact that no one wants to engage with you is something that is easily solved by manipulating the political stability of the country in which you are investing in order to get them to agree with you. Opposition's entire argument rests on the framework that you don't have what we have on our side, which is the immense power that comes with the Chinese ability to actually change the decisions of governments around the world to actually accept your projects, actually allow you to fly in thousands of workers to work on your projects, actually allow you to build the bridges that maybe your government doesn't need. This motion whether or not this is good for people writ large, it's good for people in China. People in China are benefited when they have jobs and are able to actually produce the things that they're trained to produce. But let's do some weighing against OG. What does OG tell us? Number one, they say that exports are somewhat necessary for the Chinese economy. We think this is somewhat weakened by OO's claim that China can transition to just individual trade deals. This is something that Jinmo's and I's case completely deals with. When we tell you the short-term nature of trade deals, it means that you don't actually get the kind of stability we're talking about. And we also talk about how this transition that they talk about isn't actually feasible for the type of economy that we see that China has. But second of all, what OG tells us about is soft power. And we think our framing outweighs this. This is where it comes in. We see the impact on the average Chinese citizen when it comes to things like soft power, when it comes that your ability to represent yourself on the UN stage is actually marginally small, given absent nuclear holocaust or something like that. We think the actual real impact you get on the lives of an average Chinese citizen comes of the type of job they have, comes on their ability to move to an urban area instead of the rural one, comes on their country's ability to actually provide them with social services. All of these things only happen on our side of the house when you're guaranteeing economic benefits to the people within your country. Look, at the end of the day, OP has to recognize that the economic structure of China is one that you cannot just transition at the snap of a finger. It's one that requires you to offload the massive amounts of goods that they currently have, which only happens on our side of the house when we're guaranteed long-term deals that actually keep the economy stable. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. To close the op case and indeed the debate, I'd like to invite the operator Celia.
There are two areas of this debate. The first thing that we're going to talk about is what China should prioritize, and secondly, I'm going to chat with you about how this is a bad way for China to secure international influence. So, first, on what China should prioritize. What closing government provides you is the argument that China should prioritize domestic economic reforms. I'm going to give you clear reasons as to why this priority is more important than the kinds of things that other teams in this debate talk to you about. But first, I just want to make it clear that opening government tells you that China benefits from international leadership. We tell you that there exists a trade-off between economic reforms and government's case. At that point, I think that China is less able to provide economic benefits domestically when it engages in the kinds of things that opening government wants you to do. Why does this trade-off exist? I think that state-owned enterprises are tied together. That is to say that when you set up a media organization in Nairobi, you also have to support the existence of that state-owned enterprise in Beijing. That means that when you have a state-owned enterprise that is located domestically, it is subject to the same kind of regulatory environment as what you have abroad. But oftentimes, it's not just that you have to harmonize the regulations. It's often the exact same corporations, the exact same companies that do business in East Africa, trying to influence people's ideology and do business within China. So what closing government tells us is that the political power of state-owned enterprises is too high in China for you to be able to reform. I think that you just have to look empirically at the question of how China has been able to reform in the past. I think the Communist Party probably does have influence that extends over and above that of these individual kinds of corporations. But also I think it's the individual kind of local leaders who run these kinds of things. I think Xi Jinping can probably make choices that go over and above that. But also I think China is increasingly moving towards privatization. So I don't think that the SOE political role is going to be more important than that of the private role of the companies that the government has talked about a lot in this debate, like Huawei. At that point, also, this closing government tells us that there's an immediate problem of overcapacity, meaning that you can't reform. So the reason that they say that it means you can't reform is because this has the harm of getting to economic collapse. But I don't think that they ever prove to you that you do get to economic collapse. I think that it's reasonable for us to say that, like, yeah, maybe some companies go under because they produce too many shoes, but I don't think that that's actually a sufficient argument. Next thing I want to say. So opening government talks to us in this debate about how the interests of the Chinese people should be understood through the lens of how they have a high upside and a low downside, how like technology is growing, how poverty reduction is happening, but there's a risk that this ability to fight poverty will go down in the future. So first, you don't need 10% growth to have poverty reduction. That is to say that you can have solidaristic welfare-style policies, and you can have redistribution between regions if that is a goal that you care about. But second, I think even with less, I think we also probably get more growth on our side of the house at the point where China is better able to support its domestic companies, but also it means that it's better able to secure international influence that allows for it to have markets. Opening opposition talks to us in this debate about how the nature of China's political relationship in the world is such that it has been harmed by global, that China has been harmed by its exclusion from these kinds of international institutions. I think that this is a good argument, but I think that there's, government teams pointed out that in this debate that China is still able to trade at the point where it is not leading these kinds of institutions. At that point, I don't think that we need to defer to this part of the round. Opening opposition also talks to us about how a growing consumer demand means that China needs to invest, and it is important, and that China needs to invest in its own people. But opening opposition, the key problem here is that the resources the government wants to invest abroad are not likely to be especially high. What is more important in terms of this is the ways in which the regulatory environment is able to shape Chinese domestic growth. That is to say that like the regulatory environment affects trillions of dollars in the entire Chinese economy, whereas like the few million or few billion dollars that are invested in like media conglomerates in Nairobi are not going to have the same comparative impact on the Chinese economy. Next thing to say on China's priorities, though, is just why the problem is that China lacks economic, is that China has a significant amount of inefficiency. We talked to you about SOEs and how these SOEs are likely to not be making the same kinds of market choices as the private actors that they would be able to make if they were privatized. We also talked about nepotism, how the kinds of leadership that are shapes how this broad sector of the economy is run is just something that is not in the interests of the Chinese people, because you aren't able to have as many jobs, you aren't able to develop as many resources, you aren't able to invest in your own capital as well when you have this kind of nepotist style leadership. But then the next thing Sandy talks to us about is just about how privatizing these SOEs is significantly beneficial. I think that we solve for this kind of lack of competition. We create lower labor costs, and that means that we're able to provide for a better structure for China in the future. I think that this priority is more important than anything else that has come out in this debate. And at that point, the next thing I guess I will talk about is why this is a bad way for China to become a superpower. First, I'll take closing.
Okay, your claim is that Xi Jinping and the CCP recognize the need to reform, yet Xi Jinping is the biggest proponent of Chinese expansionism. So either the push to reform within the CCP is not as strong as you claim, meaning your argument doesn't make sense, or they're not mutually exclusive, as Emma told you.
Yeah, so I don't think that this is just about Xi Jinping. I think that China will presumably have a different leader within 5 to 10 years, something like that. At that point, I think that we can use examples of Xi Jinping acting in one way in one situation and in a different way in a different situation to make it clear that he at least does sometimes act in the first way. That kind of political impetus does exist within China. I think China is able to reform. That was the extent of my Xi Jinping example. Okay. The second area of this debate, though, is about how this is a bad way for China to become a superpower. So opening opposition talks to us in this debate about how there's hostility from the United States, and that this is, or this might have been OG, how there's hostility from the United States, and it's important that China be able to work with the be able to like use this kind of market. But I think what is very important is that China be able to sell its goods to the other developing markets in the world, be able to sell its goods to those markets where it would not be able to if it angered them, if it used the kind of ideological pressure that Sandy tells you is so problematic, like the newspaper that he read in Johannesburg. I think that these kinds of markets are more important to China because China sells a ton of goods abroad, and the United States, while it is large, does not outweigh those other markets in its international influence on China's economy. We think that China causes significant problems for itself when it meddles. It makes it so that it is unable to get this, access to these kinds of markets. The clear comparative in this debate is that other states turn away from China. Other states make it so that they work with Canada or Germany or India or Japan, and they don't work with China, making it so that China loses out on access to these kinds of important partners. I think that yes, China does have some influence. Maybe some states will work with China on either side, but we do give you the clear difference that many states do have this bargaining ability. China is not a superpower, and it would be problematic if it were to become one, because it would be problematic if if we were to do it in this way, because that would mean that you get more examples like Malaysia, where China tried to invest, but then the state had domestic political pressure for it to move away from that. Closing government talks to us about overcapacity, but I think it's clear that you can better remedy this when you have a better ability to work with these same markets. So Sandy actually solves for the same thing that they think is so important. And then also, closing government talks to us about internal migration in China. So one, you can just build apartments with the money that you're saving. Two, I think you probably are better able to support this by building like regional cities, which China has been doing. It's not the case that Beijing's housing shortage is the most important thing in this debate. So because China should prioritize its domestic economy, because you're better able to engage internationally on our side anyway, we're so happy to oppose.